Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Georgia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing the places and times of day or night these documented accounts reach. It was during the harsh winter of 1838 when Savannah, Georgia, first heard the whispers. The Harwood plantation, some 20 miles northwest of the city, had always been known for its prosperity and the peculiar quietness of its grounds. Local residents would often remark how even the birds seemed to avoid flying over its sprawling cotton fields. But it wasn't until February of that year that people began to question what truly happened behind the white columns of the main house. The Harwood estate was owned by Nathaniel Harwood, a man whose reputation in Savannah society had been carefully crafted over 20 years. He was known as a businessman of considerable means, a widower who kept largely to himself except for occasional appearances at church and city council meetings. What few people knew, however, was that the source of his wealth extended beyond merely cotton and tobacco. There was something about the way the light fell across his face during Sunday services that made several parishioners uncomfortable, though none could articulate exactly why. On the morning of February 12, 1838, a young woman was discovered walking barefoot along the Savannah River Road, her clothing torn and her eyes vacant. According to the account later filed by Sheriff Thomas Calloway, the woman identified herself only as Elizabeth and refused to speak of where she had come from or to whom she belonged. What caught the sheriff's attention, however, was not her disheveled appearance, but rather the quality of her speech and the fairness of her skin. As noted in his report, the young woman speaks as one educated, yet bears no identification and claims no family name. For 3 days, she was housed in the county jail, while notices were posted throughout Chatham County. It was on the afternoon of the 15th when Nathaniel Harwood arrived at the sheriff's office, hat in hand, claiming the young woman was his property, a house slave who had been with the family since childhood and who had recently become troubled in the mind. The sheriff noted something unusual in his journal that evening. Mr. Harwood refused to look directly at the girl when claiming her. When asked her name, he hesitated before saying Betsy, not Elizabeth as she had given. The girl herself remained silent throughout, though I observed her hands trembling severely. What happened next would not become known until many years later, when a collection of letters was discovered during renovations to the old Savannah courthouse in 1966. These letters, exchanged between Sheriff Calloway and his brother in Charleston, revealed suspicions that were never officially documented. "There is something in the girl's eyes," he wrote, "that reminds me powerfully of Harwood himself. I cannot shake the feeling that there is more to this story than a simple case of a runaway." The Harwood plantation sat at the end of a long avenue of live oak trees, their branches draped with Spanish moss that seemed to absorb all sound. The main house had been built in 1793, and local stories told of how 3 craftsmen had died during its construction, falling from scaffolding in circumstances that were never clearly explained. Behind the house stretched 2 rows of smaller dwellings where the enslaved workers lived, and beyond that, almost hidden by a stand of pine trees, stood a small cabin set apart from the others. According to tax records from 1835, Nathaniel Harwood claimed ownership of 47 enslaved individuals. However, parish records indicate that the number of baptisms and burials performed for the Harwood plantation never seemed to align with this figure. The local minister, Reverend James Whitaker, noted in his personal diary, discovered in 1954 during a church renovation, that he had been called to the plantation unusually often to perform last rites, yet was never shown the deceased. After returning to the plantation, Elizabeth disappeared from public record. No mention of her appears in any official document for the next 6 months. It was not until August of 1838 that her name resurfaces, this time in the ledger of a slave trader named Gerald Finch, whose offices were located near the Savannah docks. The entry, dated August 23rd, records the sale of one mulatto woman, aged approximately 20 years, named Elizabeth, to a buyer from New Orleans. The price paid was significantly higher than market value for an enslaved woman at that time. What makes this transaction particularly notable is a notation in the margin of Finch's ledger. Special instructions from NH regarding transport. No contact with other Harwood property. This entry was underlined twice. The Savannah Morning News, from August 25, 1838, carried a small item on its third page. Prominent planter N. Harwood announces intention to travel abroad for health reasons. His business affairs to be managed by Mr. Samuel Whitfield until his return. Harwood would not be seen in Savannah again for nearly a year. During the renovation of St. John's Episcopal Church in 1959, workers discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of pew number 16, the pew that had belonged to the Harwood family. Inside was a small leather-bound journal. The journal contained entries written in a delicate, educated hand, spanning from 1830 to 1838. Though the first page had been torn out, removing the owner's name, the content made it clear that the writer was a young woman living at the Harwood plantation. The most revealing entry, dated January 10, 1838, reads, "Father continues to deny the truth, even to himself. Yesterday he looked through me as if I were a stranger, though we share the same eyes. Mother's letter remains my only proof, and I fear what will happen should he discover I have it. The new overseer watches me constantly. I must find a way to reach Savannah and the lawyer mother mentioned." Church records indicate that Nathaniel Harwood's wife, Catherine, had died in childbirth in 1818. The infant, a girl, was recorded as having died as well. However, baptismal records show that a female child named Elizabeth was baptized at St. John's Church just 3 months later, listed as ward of N. Harwood. The mystery deepened when, during an archaeological survey conducted in 1964, researchers from Emory University uncovered the remnants of a small schoolroom behind the main house of the former Harwood plantation. Among the items recovered were primers, a slate board, and several books in French and English. According to the plantation's inventory from 1825, no such schoolroom was ever officially documented, and education of enslaved people was prohibited by Georgia law at that time. The investigation into what truly happened at the Harwood plantation might have ended there had it not been for the persistence of one researcher. Dr. Margaret Forsyth, a historian specializing in antebellum Georgia, came across the case while researching women's experiences in the pre-Civil War South. In 1963, she tracked down a descendant of Samuel Whitfield, the man who had managed Harwood's affairs during his absence. In the attic of the Whitfield family home in Atlanta, she discovered a locked chest containing correspondence between Whitfield and Harwood during the latter's time abroad. One letter in particular, dated December 12, 1838, and postmarked from London, contained a disturbing passage. "The matter we discussed has been concluded to my satisfaction. I trust that all documentation has been handled as instructed and that no connection can be traced. The sum deposited in your account should compensate for any inconvenience. Upon my return, I expect never to hear mention of this again." A separate letter from Whitfield to his wife, never sent but found in the same collection, revealed more. "I cannot in good conscience continue in this deception. What Harwood has done to his own flesh and blood haunts my dreams. The girl had her mother's letters, proof of their marriage in Boston and of her legitimate birth. Rather than acknowledge his daughter by his legally wedded wife, he chose to erase her existence when questions began to arise about her unusual status in his household, that he would sell his own child rather than recognize her rightful place. I can scarcely comprehend such depravity." The paper trail grows cold after Harwood's return to Savannah in September of 1839. Parish records show he resumed his place in society, though several accounts mention a marked change in his demeanor. The diary of Mrs. Eleanor Bradford, a prominent Savannah socialite, notes that Mr. H. has returned from abroad much altered. His hair has gone entirely grey, and he starts violently at sudden noises. He no longer entertains and has twice been observed talking to himself on the street. In 1842, Nathaniel Harwood died in what was officially recorded as a hunting accident. The coroner's report, however, contains some curious details. The fatal shot was fired at extremely close range, yet no powder burns were found on his clothing. More strangely, despite the inclement weather that day, Harwood's boots were described as meticulously clean, as if recently polished. The Harwood plantation passed to a distant cousin in Virginia who sold the property within a year. The main house burned to the ground in 1846, a fire attributed to lightning, though it occurred on what witnesses described as a clear, moonlit night. What became of Elizabeth Harwood after her sale to New Orleans remained unknown until 1968, when a researcher at Tulane University discovered records from a Creole family named Devereux. These records included the manumission papers for an enslaved woman purchased in 1838, whom the family had freed upon discovering her background and education. According to family correspondence, the woman eventually established herself as a teacher of music and languages in the free black community of New Orleans. One letter written by Marie Devereux to her son in France mentions, "The young woman who now resides with the Lafitte family bears a remarkable resemblance to the portrait of Catherine Harwood that I once saw in Savannah. I believe there can be no doubt as to her parentage. What darkness must reside in a man's soul to deny his own child and condemn her to such a fate?" The last verified document concerning Elizabeth appears in the Registry of Yellow Fever Victims from 1853 in New Orleans. A woman identified as Elizabeth Freeman, teacher formerly of Georgia, is listed among the deceased. She was approximately 35 years old. In 1958, during the demolition of a former bank building in Savannah that had once housed Gerald Finch's offices, workers discovered a hidden compartment in the wall safe. Inside was a sealed envelope containing a single sheet of paper, a letter written in a feminine hand, addressed to Father, but apparently never delivered. The letter reads, in part, "By the time you read these words, if indeed you ever do, I will be beyond your reach. What you have done to me, denying my existence, my rightful name, and finally my freedom, may be hidden from the world, but it is known to God. Mother warned me in her letters what might happen if she died, but I could not believe a father would erase his child so completely. The truth cannot remain buried forever." The letter was dated August 22, 1838, one day before Elizabeth was sold to the New Orleans buyer. For decades, visitors to the former site of the Harwood plantation reported a peculiar phenomenon. In the early evening, particularly during the winter months, the sound of footsteps could sometimes be heard walking from the location of the former main house toward the road, footsteps that leave no marks in the frost and stop abruptly at the property line. Local residents named this phenomenon Elizabeth's Walk and speak of it in hushed tones. In 1967, when Interstate 75 was being constructed nearby, workers reported finding a small metal box buried beneath an ancient oak tree that had to be removed. The box contained a tarnished locket with two miniature portraits inside, a woman resembling Catherine Harwood based on her church portrait, and a young girl of perhaps 5 years of age. The inscription inside read simply, "My beloved Elizabeth, never forget who you truly are." The land where the Harwood plantation once stood remains largely undeveloped to this day. In 1969, a developer purchased the property with plans to build a residential subdivision. After several unexplained accidents during the initial survey work, including equipment failures and a mysterious fire that destroyed the construction trailer, the project was abandoned. The developer later filed for bankruptcy, citing extraordinary and unforeseen circumstances related to the Harwood property. The most recent chapter in this dark history occurred in 1965, when a graduate student researching plantation economies discovered a sealed section in the Finch slave trading records. Hidden among mundane business correspondence was a note from Nathaniel Harwood to Gerald Finch, dated 1 week before Elizabeth's sale. It read, The matter we discussed requires the utmost discretion. The young woman in question must be transported far enough that her return would be impossible, and placed in circumstances where her claims would not be believed. I leave the details to your expertise, but insist that no connection to me can ever be established. The additional $500 should ensure your careful handling of this delicate matter. Local historians have attempted to locate any living descendants of Elizabeth Harwood in New Orleans, but the trail seems to end with her death in 1853. However, the Devereux family papers mention that she formed an attachment with a musician named Joseph Lafitte, though no record of marriage has been found. What remains of this tragic story are fragments, documents, letters, and artifacts that paint a picture of a father's ultimate betrayal. A man who, rather than acknowledge his daughter's legitimate claim to his name and fortune, chose to sell her as property. The psychological horror of Elizabeth's experience, raised in secret isolation, educated yet enslaved, and ultimately betrayed by her own father, stands as a testament to the darkest capacities of the human soul. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the story is how close it came to being lost entirely. Had Elizabeth not attempted to escape that February, had Sheriff Calloway not noted his suspicions, had the hidden documents not been discovered decades later during renovations and construction, Nathaniel Harwood's secret might have remained buried forever, just as he intended. In the courthouse archives of Savannah, the original sheriff's report of Elizabeth's discovery still exists, now yellowed with age. The final line reads, "There is something in the girl's countenance that suggests she knows far more than she reveals. I cannot help but wonder what truths lie buried beneath her silence. Some truths, it seems, refuse to remain buried. They echo through time like footsteps on a frost-covered path, leaving no visible trace, but heard nonetheless by those who listen closely enough. To this day, locals avoid the former Harwood land after sunset. They speak of sudden cold spots, even in summer, and the sensation of being watched from among the trees that have reclaimed the once-cleared plantation grounds. Whether these phenomena have any connection to the tragedy that unfolded there in 1838 is a matter of speculation. What is not speculation, however, is the documented evidence of a father who chose to sell his own daughter rather than acknowledge her rightful place in his life, a betrayal so profound that its echoes continue to resonate nearly 2 centuries later in the collective memory of a community. The final known document relating to Elizabeth Harwood is a brief mention in the journal of a New Orleans doctor who attended yellow fever victims in 1853. He wrote, "Among today's losses was a remarkable woman, teacher to many of the city's free-colored children. With her final breath, she asked me to record that she was Elizabeth Harwood, daughter of Catherine and Nathaniel, born free and dying free. I know not what significance this holds, but I honor her last request here. Some stories end with resolution, with justice served or truths acknowledged. The story of Elizabeth Harwood offers no such comfort. It stands instead as a stark reminder of how easily power can be wielded to erase identities, sever family bonds, and bury inconvenient truths. But it also demonstrates how fragments of truth can survive, reassembling themselves piece by piece across decades until a more complete picture emerges from the silence. In the archives of Emory University, a collection now known as the Elizabeth Harwood Papers preserves what little remains of her story. Researchers and students still pore over these documents, searching for additional clues that might fill the remaining gaps. Each year, on the anniversary of her documented escape, February 12th, a small group gathers at the site of the former plantation to leave flowers beneath the single remaining live oak tree, now estimated to be over 300 years old. They come not only to remember Elizabeth, but to acknowledge the countless others whose stories have been lost to time and deliberate erasure. In their silent vigil, there is a recognition that some wounds in our collective history have never properly healed, that they continue to affect us in ways both seen and unseen. As one local historian remarked during a commemoration in 1968, the true horror of Elizabeth Harwood's story lies not in dramatic violence, but in the calculated coldness with which her own father denied her humanity. It is a reminder that the most profound betrayals often occur not between strangers, but within families, behind closed doors, in places where trust should be absolute. The sun has long since set on the Harwood plantation. The fields where cotton once grew have returned to forest. The foundations of the main house have crumbled and been reclaimed by the Georgia soil. But some say that on cold winter nights, when the wind blows from the east and the moon is obscured by clouds, a figure can sometimes be seen walking slowly along the old river road, a young woman in torn clothing, her eyes fixed on the distant lights of Savannah, carrying with her a secret that would take more than a century to reveal. For those who study such histories, the story of Elizabeth Harwood serves as a somber reminder that some of the darkest chapters in our past are not the dramatic events recorded in history books, but the quiet, personal betrayals that occurred in the shadows, betrayals that in their intimate cruelty reveal more about human nature than we might wish to know. In the words of Dr. Margaret Forsyth, whose tireless research brought much of this story to light, the horror of what happened to Elizabeth Harwood lies not in supernatural elements or graphic violence, but in the recognition that such calculated betrayal by a father of his own child represents a failure of our most fundamental human connections. It is in these failures, rather than in any external monster, that true horror resides. The light of historical inquiry continues to illuminate dark corners of our past, revealing stories that some would prefer remained hidden. The account of Nathaniel Harwood and his daughter Elizabeth stands as testimony to both the depths of human callousness and the persistence of truth across time. Listen carefully enough, and you might still hear the echoes of footsteps on the old river road, a daughter walking toward a freedom that should never have been denied her, carrying with her documents that would eventually expose a father's unforgivable betrayal. The Savannah Historical Society archives contain a curious document that adds another layer to this already disturbing narrative. In 1840, 2 years before his death, Nathaniel Harwood made substantial donations to 3 different churches in the area. The donation records discovered in 1962 show identical amounts given to each institution, along with a peculiar stipulation that prayers be said for the souls of those unjustly separated. No further explanation was provided, and the clergy apparently asked no questions of a man whose generosity was so readily displayed. A journal belonging to Harwood's personal physician, Dr. William Crawford, shed some light on his final years. The entries, spanning from 1840 to 1842, describe a man increasingly plagued by insomnia and what the doctor termed nervous agitation. According to Crawford's notes from March 1841, Mr. H. continues to complain of footsteps heard in the night, though servants report no disturbances. Have prescribed laudanum for sleep, but patient claims it makes the voices more distinct rather than silencing them. Another entry, dated January 12, 1842, just months before Harwood's death, reads, "Called to the plantation past midnight. Found Mr. H. in a state of extreme distress, claiming to have seen a figure standing at the foot of his bed, a young woman in torn clothing with his own eyes staring back at him. The servants report he was alone in the locked room. His terror seems genuine, though the cause is surely internal rather than supernatural. The mind, when burdened with guilt, is capable of producing its own tormentors." The hunting accident that claimed Nathaniel Harwood's life occurred on the morning of May 7, 1842. The party consisted of Harwood, his overseer James Collier, and 2 other local landowners. According to statements given to the sheriff, the men had separated to follow different game trails when a shot was heard. Harwood was found minutes later with a fatal wound to the chest. What the official report failed to mention, but was later revealed in a letter from one of the hunting companions to his wife, was that Harwood had been acting strangely all morning. "He kept looking over his shoulder," the letter stated, as if expecting to find someone following him. Twice he called out a name, Elizabeth or something similar, though we were quite alone in that section of the woods. The most peculiar thing, however, was his insistence on stopping at the river before beginning the hunt. He stood at the water's edge for nearly 10 minutes, staring at his own reflection and muttering words none of us could make out. The coroner who examined Harwood's body noted in his private journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1856, several unusual aspects of the case. The angle of the wound, he wrote, suggests the gun was fired from slightly above the victim, yet the accompanying party insists no one was positioned on higher ground. More curious still is the absence of powder burns, despite the close-range nature of the shot. Most puzzling of all is the expression frozen on the deceased's face, not one of pain or surprise, but rather a strange look of recognition, as if he had seen someone familiar just before the fatal shot. No charges were ever filed in connection with Harwood's death. The official verdict remained accidental discharge during a hunting expedition, though rumors persisted in Savannah society about the true nature of his demise. One particularly persistent story, recorded in the diary of Reverend Whitaker, claimed that Harwood died with the name of his long-absent wife on his lips, calling out to Catherine as if she stood before him in those final moments. The subsequent history of the Harwood plantation adds another layer to this tragic narrative. After passing to Harwood's cousin in Virginia, the property changed hands multiple times in rapid succession. No owner managed to make the land profitable, despite its previously high yields. Farm workers reported equipment failures, inexplicable crop blights affecting only certain fields, and livestock that refused to graze in specific areas near the former main house. When the mansion burned in 1846, several witnesses reported a strange phenomenon. Despite the intensity of the flames, which completely consumed the structure, the fire never spread to the surrounding trees or outbuildings. Even more peculiarly, a single room, later identified through floor plans as Harwood's personal study, remained untouched by the flames, though it stood in the center of the inferno. Inside this preserved room, according to the account of Fire Captain Jeremiah Brooks, they found a woman's locket on the desk, open to reveal portraits of a mother and child, with no sign of how it came to be there. The locket disappeared from the evidence collected by local authorities and was not seen again until its rediscovery more than a century later beneath the oak tree. In New Orleans, Elizabeth's brief life as a free woman left few official traces, but oral histories preserved by the free black community provide glimpses of her final years. These accounts, collected by researchers from Dillard University in 1962, describe a woman of uncommon dignity who spoke little of her past but devoted herself to ensuring the children she taught understood their own worth. One particularly moving testimony came from Honoré Lafayette, who as a child had been one of Elizabeth's music students. In his 90s, when interviewed, he recalled, "She had the most remarkable eyes, light-colored, almost golden in certain light. She taught us more than just notes on a page. She would say, 'Remember who you are, no matter what others call you.' During the yellow fever, when many fled, she stayed to care for the sick. She said she knew what it meant to be abandoned and would not inflict that pain on others." Another former student, Marie-Claire Dubois, remembered Elizabeth's peculiar reaction whenever slave traders passed through the streets. She would stop speaking mid-sentence and turn completely still, like someone turned to stone. Once I saw her press her hand against a letter she kept in her pocket, as if to reassure herself it was still there. After the traders passed, she would say something that stayed with me: "The worst chains are those you cannot see." The yellow fever epidemic that claimed Elizabeth's life swept through New Orleans in the summer of 1853, killing nearly 8,000 residents. According to hospital records, Elizabeth served as a volunteer nurse until contracting the disease herself in late August. The doctor who recorded her final statement about her true identity also noted, "Though delirious with fever, the woman maintained a remarkable clarity about certain matters. She made me promise to send word of her passing to the sheriff of Chatham County, Georgia, a curious request I fulfilled, though I understood not its significance. This letter, discovered in the effects of Sheriff Calloway's son in 1957, had apparently never been opened. Inside was a simple message. Elizabeth Harwood, once known to you as a nameless fugitive, has departed this life as a free woman, her true identity reclaimed. May this knowledge bring peace to those who sought justice on her behalf. In a cruel twist of fate, this notification arrived in Savannah just 1 week after Thomas Calloway himself had succumbed to a stroke. Whether he ever learned the final chapter of the story that had troubled him 15 years earlier remains unknown. The Harwood bloodline did not end with Nathaniel's death. Records from the Virginia branch of the family show that his cousin had 2 sons, both of whom later moved west during the gold rush. Descendants of this line still exist today, though many changed their surname during the 20th century, perhaps to distance themselves from the family's troubling past. More intriguing is the possibility of Elizabeth's own descendants. While no marriage record exists, the testimony of several contemporaries suggests her relationship with Joseph Lafitte resulted in at least 1 child. Parish records from St. Augustine's Church in New Orleans list the baptism of a Mary Elizabeth Lafitte, daughter of Joseph, in 1849, with no mother named, a common practice for children born to mixed-race or complicated family situations. This child would have been only 4 years old when Elizabeth died. Her subsequent fate is not documented in any official records discovered thus far. However, oral histories from New Orleans' Treme neighborhood mention a light-skinned music teacher who carried a gold locket containing portraits of her mother and grandmother, active in the community from the 1860s through the 1880s. The possibility that Elizabeth's lineage continues unbroken to the present day adds another dimension to this historical tragedy, descendants who may carry her blood without knowing the remarkable story of their ancestor. In 1967, the Georgia Historical Society placed a small marker near the site of the former Harwood plantation. The plaque makes no mention of Elizabeth specifically, noting only that the land was once the site of significant historical events relating to the antebellum period. Local residents, however, have their own way of remembering. For generations, parents in the area have told their children never to walk alone on the river road after dark, lest Elizabeth mistake you for the one she seeks. The documents that first led to Elizabeth's desperate flight from the plantation, her mother's letters proving her legitimate birth and rightful status, have never been found. Some historians speculate they were destroyed by Nathaniel Harwood after recapturing his daughter. Others suggest Elizabeth may have concealed them somewhere on the plantation grounds before her second permanent departure. If the latter theory is correct, these crucial pieces of evidence may still lie hidden somewhere beneath the Georgia soil, waiting to be discovered. In the absence of these documents, historians have pieced together a probable timeline of events based on available evidence. Catherine Harwood, née Catherine Prescott of Boston, apparently met and legally married Nathaniel during one of his business trips north around 1817. She returned with him to Georgia, but died giving birth to their daughter in 1818. Why Nathaniel chose to hide his legitimate marriage and deny his daughter her rightful place remains a matter of speculation. Some historians point to potential financial motivations. Catherine may have come from a family opposed to slavery, and acknowledging the marriage could have complicated his business affairs. Others suggest more personal reasons, perhaps related to Savannah society's strict social codes or his own complex relationship with his deceased wife. What is clear from the evidence is that Elizabeth was raised in a strange limbo, educated as would befit a planter's daughter, yet kept isolated from society and officially categorized among the enslaved people he owned. The discovery of her mother's letters, likely hidden by Catherine herself before her death, would have revealed to Elizabeth both the truth of her parentage and the magnitude of her father's betrayal. Dr. Margaret Forsyth, whose research brought much of this story to light, offered perhaps the most insightful analysis of the psychological dynamics at play. In Elizabeth, she wrote in her 1965 monograph. Nathaniel Harwood created a living reminder of the wife he had lost, a daughter with Catherine's features but his own distinctive eyes. Rather than embrace this connection, he chose to bury it, creating an impossible situation that could only end in tragedy. When Elizabeth discovered the truth and confronted him with it, his response was not to acknowledge her rightful place, but to eliminate the problem entirely by selling her far beyond the reach of anyone who might believe her claims. The final piece of this historical puzzle emerged in 1968, when renovations to an old building in the New Orleans French Quarter uncovered a hidden space beneath the floorboards. Inside was a small wooden box containing several items: a tarnished key, a pressed flower, and a folded piece of paper. The paper, when carefully unfolded by conservators, revealed a map of the Harwood plantation with a small X marked near the river bend, alongside a note in a feminine hand, "Where truth lies buried, awaiting discovery." Whether this cache was left by Elizabeth herself or by someone connected to her remains unknown. Equally uncertain is whether the marked location contains the missing letters or some other evidence of her true identity. The land where the Harwood plantation once stood is now partly submerged due to changes in the river's course over the past century, making excavation difficult if not impossible. Perhaps this is fitting. Some aspects of the past remain beyond our reach, submerged beneath the waters of time. What survives are fragments, echoes, and the persistent sense that some stories refuse to remain buried, no matter how powerful the forces aligned against them. In 2003, a graduate student researching antebellum diaries discovered a previously overlooked entry in the journal of a Savannah seamstress. Dated March 1838, just weeks after Elizabeth's recapture by Nathaniel, it reads, "Called to the H. plantation today to alter garments. Observed the master's strange behavior toward the girl they call Eve. He will not look directly at her, yet when her back is turned, he watches her with an expression I cannot name. The girl herself moves like one walking in sleep. When I commented on the unusual color of her eyes, so like her master's, the housekeeper quickly hushed me. There are secrets in that house that the walls themselves seem to hold." This entry provides one of the few contemporaneous observations of the dynamic between father and daughter in the months between Elizabeth's failed escape attempt and her sail to New Orleans. The unnamed seamstress, with an outsider's perspective, captured in a few lines the unnatural tension that must have permeated the household. Nathaniel unable to acknowledge the truth, yet unable to ignore it. Elizabeth moving through her days with the knowledge that her own father had denied her identity and would soon sell her away rather than recognize her rightful place. The psychological horror of Elizabeth's situation during those final months on the plantation exceeds anything found in Gothic fiction. To live under the same roof as the father who denied her, to be treated as property by the man whose blood flowed in her veins, to know that her attempt to claim her rightful identity had failed so completely. These circumstances represent a uniquely American nightmare, one born not of supernatural forces, but of the all-too-human capacity for betrayal. In the decades following the Civil War, as the South reckoned with its past and constructed new narratives about the antebellum era, stories like Elizabeth's were systematically erased or rewritten. The complex and often disturbing reality of family relationships that crossed the boundary between enslaver and enslaved was sanitized or simply omitted from historical accounts. It would take more than a century and the persistent efforts of researchers unwilling to accept comfortable myths for these hidden histories to begin re-emerging into public consciousness. The story of Elizabeth Harwood, pieced together from fragments across time, stands as testimony to both the human capacity for cruelty and the enduring power of truth to surface despite all efforts to suppress it. It reminds us that the most profound horrors in our history are not supernatural but entirely human in origin, the calculated decisions of individuals to deny the humanity of others, even those connected to them by the closest bonds of blood. On a rainy afternoon in October 1969, an elderly woman visited the Georgia Historical Society archives in Savannah. According to the visitor log, she gave her name as Marie Lafitte and listed her residence as New Orleans. She requested to see all available materials related to the Harwood plantation, spending several hours reviewing documents in silence. Before leaving, she handed the archivist a sealed envelope with instructions that it not be opened until after her death. The woman was never seen at the archives again. Inquiries sent to the address she provided in New Orleans received no response. The envelope remained sealed in the Society's vault, its contents unknown. In 1972, a notice appeared in the New Orleans Times-Picayune, announcing the death of Marie Elizabeth Lafitte at the age of 123 years, an obviously impossible age that most assumed was a typographical error. The Historical Society, noting the name's similarity to their mysterious visitor, opened the sealed envelope as instructed. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing just 3 sentences. My grandmother's name was Elizabeth Harwood, daughter of Catherine and Nathaniel. She taught me that our greatest inheritance is not wealth or land, but truth. Now her story can finally be told. Also enclosed was a small key, tarnished with age but carefully preserved. What lock this key was meant to open, and whether it still exists somewhere, waiting to reveal further secrets of the Harwood family, remains one of the enduring mysteries of this dark chapter in Georgia's history. For those who study such narratives, the story of Elizabeth Harwood represents something beyond a simple historical account. It serves as a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about our collective past, about how power could be wielded to rewrite identities, sever family bonds, and bury inconvenient truths. But it also demonstrates the remarkable resilience of truth itself, how it persists in fragments, in whispers, in unexpected discoveries that gradually reassemble themselves across decades until a more complete picture emerges from the silence. As visitors walk the quiet trails that now cross the former Harwood lands, few realize they are treading on ground haunted not by supernatural specters, but by the echoes of real human suffering and betrayal. The true ghost that lingers here is not Elizabeth's restless spirit, but the uncomfortable knowledge of what one man was willing to do to his own daughter, a betrayal so profound that its implications continue to resonate nearly 2 centuries later. The final word on this tragic history perhaps belongs to Elizabeth herself, through the single, authenticated piece of writing known to have survived in her own hand. On the back of the map discovered in New Orleans in 1968, barely visible and overlooked in initial examinations, conservators found a message written in faded ink. I was born Elizabeth Catherine Harwood, daughter of Nathaniel and Catherine, heir to all that was theirs by right of blood and law. Though he denied me in life, time will restore what truth demands. Some chains can be broken, some stories must be told. And so her story has been told, assembled piece by piece across the years, a testament to the endurance of truth and the ultimate failure of even the most determined efforts to bury it forever. In sharing this account, we honor not only Elizabeth's memory, but also the fundamental human right to identity, to family connection, and to the acknowledgement of one's rightful place in the world. Rights denied to her in life, but perhaps, in some small measure, restored through the recovery of her remarkable story. On winter evenings, when the mist rises from the Savannah River and darkness settles over the Georgia countryside, locals say you can sometimes hear the sound of footsteps on the old river road, not hurried or frantic, but steady and purposeful. They are the steps of someone who knows exactly who she is and where she belongs, walking toward a truth that can no longer be denied. For in the end, the most haunting aspect of Elizabeth Harwood's story is not that it happened, but that it nearly vanished entirely, erased by the same deliberate intent that had erased her identity in life. That her narrative survived at all, emerging piece by fragmentary piece over more than a century, stands as a powerful reminder that some truths refuse to remain buried, no matter how deeply we try to enter them. The land where the Harwood plantation once stood is quiet now. The cotton fields have returned to forest. The main house exists only as a faint outline of foundation stones, and the river has changed its course over the decades, washing away some sections of the former estate. Nature, in its patient way, has reclaimed what human ambition once seized and transformed. But for those who know where to look and how to listen, the story remains, not in ghostly manifestations or supernatural occurrences, but in documents preserved in archives, in oral histories passed down through generations, in objects unearthed from their hiding places, and in the collective memory of a community that has learned, however belatedly, to acknowledge the uncomfortable truths of its past. Elizabeth walks still, not as a restless spirit, but as a symbol of truth's persistence against all efforts to suppress it. Her footsteps echo not in the supernatural realm, but in the continuing work of historians, researchers, and ordinary citizens committed to recovering and preserving stories like hers that illuminate the darker corners of our shared history. In that persistence lies the final lesson of this narrative, that the greatest horror lies not in what we might imagine lurks beyond the veil of death, but in what we know with certainty occurred on this side of it, in the calculated cruelty of a father toward his daughter, in a society that enabled such betrayal, and in the systematic erasure of lives deemed inconvenient to the prevailing narrative. But it also reminds us of something equally powerful, that even the most determined efforts to bury the truth must eventually fail. Elizabeth Harwood's story, nearly lost to history, speaks to us still across the centuries, a voice that refused to be silenced, a truth that could not remain buried, a daughter who, in the end, reclaimed her rightful name and place in the narrative of her family and her nation's complex past. Listen carefully, and you might hear her still, walking steadily toward a future where all such buried truths finally emerge into the light.